Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Lauren Koffman, and I'd like to welcome you to the NCS podcast. Today, you've tuned into another episode in our Perspective series, where we explore the diverse perspectives in neurocritical care. Today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jamil Dibu to the podcast to discuss neurocritical care practice in the UAE and how he's been involved in the creation of a brain death protocol for the region. So Jimmy and I go back to our days in Cleveland Clinic, but for those that don't know you, would you mind giving a brief little summary of your background, where you train, and what your current position is?
Yeah. Thank you, NCS and Lauren, for the invite. It's a pleasure. Lauren, I did. So I'm born in the U.S., raised in Lebanon. I did medical school in the American University of Beirut. I went to the US in 2010, did neurology in Little Rock, Arkansas, and then 2 years of neurocritical care fellowship at Cleveland Clinic. And this is where we met. You were chief resident, I was fellow. And actually there is where I got recruited to come to Abu Dhabi, where the Cleveland Clinic opened up their hospital. So that's in a nutshell my training and how I got to Abu Dhabi.
And so did you have any idea that you'd be practicing abroad when you went into medicine, or did you just take this opportunity when it came up?
Yeah. No, so frankly, I was in fact after neurocritical care, so I did my 2 years in Cleveland Clinic. I was actually going after a stroke fellowship and then stay in the US. I had no plans to leave the US. And then while I was a fellow, the Cleveland in 2015, Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi opened their doors, and suddenly they had many of their ICU admissions were neurocritical care patients. And then they quickly realized they need a neurointensivist. As they grow, they need to set up a dedicated neuro ICU. So then they flew to Cleveland. They talked to my mentor, Dr. Mano, which you know very well, and known in the society. He was my mentor. I was fortunate to have him there with me. And he told them, just talk to Jimmy. Since I was graduating, I have ties to the region. They just plainly asked me, when you're done fellowship, can you come set up the neuro ICU? I thought it's crazy because you're a fellow. And your first obsession after fellowship is clinical and growth, exposure, and mentorship. So that's what I told Dr. Chapman, who's currently still here. He's the head of Quality Institute and Respiratory Institute from Cleveland. I told him, I'm a fellow, right? He's like, yeah. I'm like, okay, fine, I'll jump on it. And I knew I was scared because it's a big role to come set up a program out of fellowship for two reasons. One, I was scared because the clinical exposure was not guaranteed. We only had few beds of the entire hospital ICU open. We didn't know if the growth is going to be guaranteed, the clinical load is going to be there. So it was a bet that I put in. And I knew the exposure at the beginning for clinical work was tough. But then the second what made me comfortable, that's what made me uncomfortable. What made me comfortable is I knew we had a good system in Cleveland, so I just needed to replicate it. So that's really how. No, I didn't know I'm going to end up in Abu Dhabi, but it's an opportunity to be asked. I was actually 30 years old in my second year of fellowship or first year of fellowship to come set up a unit. I don't think that comes around a lot, and it's a Cleveland Clinic true DNA on the ground here.
Wow, I can't imagine how scary it must have been. And what year was that when you went to start it, and who was on your team at that point, and how has it grown since then?
Yeah. 2015, I was flown in here to interview. There were only 6 beds out of now what we have total ICU beds in the entire hospital, 72. 6 were operational, and there were mixed units. So I came to interview to set up a unit. So I tried to envision, they told me it's going to become 24 dedicated neuro ICU beds out of 72. So it was a big bet. And so 2015, I interviewed, I went for it. 2016, I came. After my fellowship, graduated in July, took a month off, best month of my life, where you wake up, there's no emails to attend to. You're not you don't have to report to anybody. Flown in here, that's August 2016. There was me. It was N of 1, and I'm the only neurointensivist, and I was responsible to, as we grow the number of beds, at that point, just to establish policies, procedures, epic order sets, acquire medications, everything from scratch. And then as the patient load increase, start recruiting accordingly. And that's really what happened. So fast forward 2016, I think there were 8 total beds. Now the hospital runs at 72 ICU beds, out of which 24 are in one unit are dedicated neuro ICU. I recruited 2 fellowship trained neurointensivists from the US, one trained with Dr. Panos in Detroit, Hussam at Cambridge, and one trained with Gretchen, worked with Gretchen Brophy in VCU. And then a nurse practitioner from Cleveland, from Hartford, and from University of Maryland. That's something we'll talk about shortly about nurse practitioners. So the team has grown, and I had 2 people, Palm Critical Care from the US, that decided to take up neuro ICU. They decided they like it at their middle age, and then we trained them. Actually, we went through how to take care of these patients. They sat even recently for the ABIM board. So for me, I consider them now also neurointensivists. So it's a big team, and we've grown pretty much to a large team with a very busy unit.
And so it sounds like all of your physicians had been trained in the US. Were all of the APPs as well US trained?
Yeah. So, and then this is part of the experience that I'm sure we're going to touch upon. So I have a couple of colleagues from Europe, and the reality is on this side of the world, there's more staff from Europe overall in the hospital, even in the country, than from North America. And it's a popular destination for UK, Italian, German trained physicians to come here for various reasons. And I have 2 or 3 of my team members on the neuro ICU. They're from Europe, and it's not the same. And we'll talk about this overall, and in terms of what are the big differences practicing here. Generally, there's not much of extreme specialization and multidisciplinary manpower in Europe as much as in the US. And I'll touch upon this shortly. And there's difference in practices. But I do have colleagues from Europe with us. And it's interesting perspective. Honestly, it teaches you a lot that what exists outside of US, actually, there's plenty. And you can adapt your practice to that. It's not always the US way, neither the Cleveland Clinic way, and it works both ways. And in terms of APPs, NPs, there's no such thing in Europe. There's no APP, NP. Even when we came to this country, we had to, the country does not have, I think in the region overall, GCC, Middle East, North Africa, there's no such thing as nurse practitioner or PA. So what we did as Cleveland Clinic, because we're used to it, our executive leadership drafted a business white paper to the country's regulatory healthcare force. They describe what NPPA is and the role of and how they can support. And they embedded that in the healthcare regulatory laws and regulations that it's allowed. And we're still today probably the only hospital that hires NPPAs, because the rest of the country, or even the region, does not really understand what the value that NPPAs bring to healthcare at this point in time.
So in other ICUs outside of the Cleveland Clinic in the area, is it just the physicians managing all of these patients, or maybe trainees as well?
Correct. So trainees less so. The training and fellowship and residency, there are. It's under development. And definitely this is one of the big key areas for the country's leadership that are asking and mandating, especially us, that ultimately we want to develop talent from the region. For the most part, for the longest, they rely on importing talent, but things are changing and they want to train. That's one of the many missions that we have. Here, there's some sort of different dynamics. This country in particular, the UAE, has some specific tiering for physicians. So if you're trained in Lebanon, say, or Egypt, did your residency and fellowship, you get hired in the UAE it's not going to be the same full role or full not seniority, full let's say it's not, you don't have the same privileges as someone trained in North America, board certified intensivist. So I think they call them associate level, and then there's consultant level. That's what we're called. If you're board certified, you're consultant. If you're from Egypt or Lebanon or Jordan, you're associate. So there's some kind of supervision or sign off on these patients from the consultant to the associate. So that's a bit of a different dynamic. Super fellows, you can call them. So that's a bit a nuance, but you can think of these guys as the fellows and APPs in North America. And then there's the board certified UK, some other countries, Germany, US, that are considered consultants or staff, as in attending staff in the US. Yeah.
And what would you say is the case mix like? Is it what you were expecting, or is it significantly different from the US?
So I was extremely lucky because I was fortunate recently to host the NCS leadership. As you know, they came visit the unit and we talked about this. Interestingly, not by it's by chance that we have exactly almost the same mix of patients as we had in main campus in Cleveland. We're very heavy in cerebrovascular diseases, very heavy, for two reasons. One is our center in the Cleveland Clinic, Abu Dhabi, Abu Dhabi is the capital of the UAE, is the only center, and frankly, potentially of the entire nation, that is capable of giving the full spectrum of care from the moment you're admitted with any stroke type till you get discharged. So we're essentially the only neuro ICU in the country dedicated, and its formal definition. And we're the only, probably in Abu Dhabi region for sure, thrombectomy capable center. So by default, the Department of Health mandates that all patients come to us. And that's number one. Number two, interestingly, in terms of patients' demographics, you probably were exposed recently to the demographics here. In the UAE, almost 80% are expats. And out of the 80%, a majority comes from Indian subcontinent and Philippines, and they're on the younger age side. And for whatever reason, someday we keep saying someday we're going to publish data. Our patients' admissions start with 40-year-old Indian patient with no past medical history presents with a large stroke or high-grade subarachnoid. It's completely different from your traditional in the US. 70-year-old with diabetic hypertension presents with the bleed. Different demographics, different pathologies. And because of these patients are the bulk of the nation in terms of demographics, it turns out that and the mandate that we have, we're the only center that can treat these patients. It turns out that we have high volume. So we're talking about over 100 ICHs per year, over 100 subarachnoid hemorrhages per year, over 200 plus, I'm sure, ischemic strokes, which are, TPA, plus or minus thrombectomy or malignant. Very heavy in cerebrovascular. Of course, we have a very advanced, fully capable neurosurgical team. So we have lots of post-ops, transsphenoidals, meningiomas, XYZ, subdurals, all that stuff. And I think it matters, honestly, in the US. Every now and then you get neuromuscular, you get status. We do see autoimmune, encephalitis. So that's really the kind of the breadth, but mainly heavily cerebrovascular.
And so you mentioned that the concept of something super specialized like neurocritical care doesn't really exist in the region. So when you started this program, was it embraced, or was there like a culture shock or pushback? What was the response?
Yeah. Actually, so in our hospital, I got a lot of support. So obviously, I know it's cliche, but it took an entire health system to support us to get this done, because they know what we had in Cleveland. We had a world-class neuro ICU. They wanted the same here. And our leadership that is physician-led, like in Cleveland Clinic, understands the value of neurocritical care. And, by default also, we were, the bulk of the admissions in the ICU, I mean, the big bulk is dominated by neuro ICU admissions. So we're a bit fortunate, I guess, compared to other hospitals, especially in main campus, for example, there's the cardiac ICU volume is much more bigger. Even medical ICU here, we're 24 beds neuro ICU, similar to the cardiac, similar to the medical. So and the leadership that came also from Cleveland understands the value of neuro ICU and know that this exists. So I was lucky. I didn't have to explain to our hospital leadership what neuro ICU is, but coming outside the Cleveland Clinic, it's a new concept. And you've seen it recently in the conference. So there's a lot subliminal, we can talk about this shortly, out of all the conferences and lectures we've given over the years, subliminally, we're educating the nation, we're educating neighboring nations about the value of having a neuro ICU dedicated. Because here in this part of the region, and I'm sure in the US, it still exists in some areas, it's the intensivist manages neck down, the surgeon will, and the neurologist will walk in, tell you about neck up, but then the interplay gets lost in translation, and therefore the outcomes are not the same. So a classic reason why neuro ICU is important, but they don't know yet that it A, exists, and B, it's important. And that's subliminally what we're trying to spread the message alongside many other things.
Okay. Looking back, if you could give, 2015, 2016 Jimmy advice as you were embarking on this, what do you think you wish you knew at that time?
The biggest thing that comes to mind, which I don't know that I would help myself back then, is I would wish I have mentorship. Which I tried. I actively reach out to everybody in the US all the time, from either mentorship, developing programs, to clinical, right? Remember, I was out of fellowship. I still didn't know it all. So I had to call up people, hey, is this the right next step in terms of management, clinical management? But the biggest thing is leadership, mentorship. I got it here proactively, but as you can imagine, at the age of 30, and some of our team members, I think on average, they're older than me by, I don't know, 10 years or so, minimum. So managing a team, setting up program at the age of 30, takes a lot of leadership skills and experience. I had the stamina, I had the proactivity, but then obviously communication and leadership, ways of handling it, there was a lot of learning on my end. I know looking back, I would like to change it, but no one is born a leader smoothly in terms of communication. And although you would think you're doing the right thing and being proactive, but you have to understand who you're dealing with. So if I go back, I would wish to probably clamp down on more leadership support and mentorship. I was again fortunate to just replicate the systems we had in Cleveland. Them, all the protocols, order sets. Honestly, I just for the most part replicated the same with some adjustment to the country's needs or variability in practice that we don't have in the US. So that helped me a lot from the clinical perspective. But then leadership was a big thing. I didn't have the time. I was graduating. I didn't realize what leadership of a big team, of a big hospital. That's the one thing I would probably work on. But we were alone. So we were a small pond. And so there was a handful of physicians in the entire hospital, and everybody had a task. So it's not like we had a leadership that's there and everybody's chill and we can mentor each other. No, it was everybody had a task, and we're racing against time, and we needed to expand X amount of beds every X amount of month. So you had just to do it and learn on the go. So that was the biggest thing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you've mentioned a few times the conference, and for those that haven't listened to some of our other podcasts, I was able to attend the Emirates Critical Care Conference about a month ago. We were able to catch up, and I was so impressed to hear your talk about brain death and the evolution of the concept in the region, because I truly had no idea that it just wasn't a thing there until several years ago, not even several, a handful of years ago. So would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about how the concept of brain death started and your role in that process?
Yeah. So before I go, I'm going to go on a little tangent related to that, and then I'll talk about the brain death evolution and talk about the role of neurocritical society and that conference per se, because it touches upon what we discussed. So the tangent is first. So, and to all the listeners that plan to come here or elsewhere to practice outside the U.S. And have never left North America. There are differences in practice, and be it so. For example, in Europe, there's no such thing as a respiratory therapist. And when we first came and we had the respiratory therapist, because it's a Cleveland Clinic model, so the European colleagues were baffled. It's like, why is someone touching my ventilator? They manage the ventilator. So we had to explain to them that there's actually people trained to do that. They don't have pharmacotherapists. They don't have dietitian. They run their own dialysis. So the biggest lesson here was starting with this minor thing with our colleagues. Know who your colleagues are, and not everything. And we used to tell them, oh, the Cleveland Clinic way. I mean, true, we try to replicate the best we can. But if your workforce mostly is from Europe or Asia, you need to understand where they're coming from, what they're used to, and what they know. So we first came and start practicing, and first patient, second patient, and then you get a patient that is suspected dead by neurologic criteria. All right. And then I look around, it's like, oh, there's no such thing as brain death. And I pull up the law. There's only you die from a heart arrest or cardiac arrest. So what do? Well, there's no comfort care. And so you just keep the patient or the suspected dead patients in front of you. And then the third aspect was the family. There's a culture of not believing that anything cannot be done anymore. And they believe that God will help, and you're not God, for the most part, again. But that was the predominant culture. Where I came from, North America, living will, advanced directive, dead by neurologic criteria, we're going to pull the tube, completely different. So that was a real culture shock. So that was 2016. Then July, it was work in the works, apparently. And then July, they come to us and say, the law now is passed. There was a law actually in 1993 to acknowledge brain death, but then it was paused. And in 2016, as the country has a vision to develop on all aspects in the country, particularly healthcare, they realized brain death has to be acknowledged, and organ donation and transplantation is a key healthcare element of practice. And we have to offer that to the country. But we need to start with brain death declaration. So the law was passed to enact the 1993, and brain death was sanctioned. So they come to us first, the National Committee, and say, well, guys, we need to set up protocols. And since we're the only neuro ICU in the country, and I was the only fellowship trained person in the country, you want to help us. So let's get on it. And I had colleagues from neurology. One of them is the chair currently, who's also a neurointensivist, but is doing more neuro IR. So I sought his help. We looked at the law. There was a lot of things not congruent with the AN guidelines, but we had to use it. So for example, temperature threshold was 34 to do an exam. I don't know what was written in 1993, but that was there. So we had to work around this stuff. They were mandating EEG for everyone. So there was a lot of variation. Some are significant, but we had to craft a policy for the hospital, share that with the National Committee to share with other hospitals, and then off we go. We started doing declaration in the hospital, teaching everyone that this exists. And the biggest culture shock was for the families. And now you're coming in telling the family, oh, we declared the patient dead. And then they look at you, obviously the first, which many people, of course, everywhere in the world, they will tell you, but there's a heart beating. They tell you, no, he's still alive. And there's this thing is only in America, is not here. You're introducing something different. So then you had to print the law, tell them this is a new change. So obviously a new change for a 50-year-old country, you're changing the entire culture. So fast forward, we went on, we developed policies, protocols. I was lucky to recruit all these good guys with me. We went on supporting the national programs, did a lot of workshops nationally every year, twice, 3 times on different conferences, educating that brain death exists, how you do it, and what are the challenges. And we're still doing it to date, and recently with the support of the leadership, which we're going to talk about. In 2022, two great things happened. One is they allowed us finally to change the actual law. So I drove a committee with 4 or 5 great physicians across the nation to implement the changes needed to honestly to bring it as closer as we can get to the AAN guidelines. So we made it simpler, no need for EEG, no need for waiting. It was waiting at least 6 hours between tests. The number of physicians, we did a lot of changes to make it simple and closer to the AAN. And at the same time, I was fortunate enough, with the help of our dear colleague Yasser Al Hassan from Kuwait, who sits on the board of directors of NCS, who responsible for establishing the MENA chapter for NCS. Part of the ECC and that conference that happens in Dubai, we started introducing brain death as a lecture, then as a workshop. Then Dr. Jin Sung came, he supervised one and helped us quarterback one. Up until in 2022, the idea came up, why don't we have the Neurocritical Care Society formally collaborate with the Ministry of Health here and conduct certification of brain death, because we lack that. And remember, we talked about earlier that there's no other, literally, besides the 3 of us here, board certified neurointensivists, everybody else is an intensivist that does neuro ICU cases or declares death. Neurologists usually are not involved, believe it or not. Usually it's anesthesia. So there was some discomfort that, are they comfortable doing it? And we removed the ancillary testing, and some are not comfortable. They think ancillary testing is the key. So we thought, and then there's the brain death toolkit. That's a perfect marriage of formally supporting the country by training them through the brain death workshop. And that's what we did. First time this year, it took many rounds of discussions to align of what the ministry needs at the level of the country, talk to them exactly the history I'm sharing with you. So, and quickly they understood what the country needs, adapted the workshops accordingly. And recently we successfully did 3 days back to back, covering essentially the entire nation. With the support of ministry, we had over 300 physicians undergo lectures by Dr. David Greer, arguably one of the leaders, and Dr. Panos Varelas, the leaders of the World Brain Death Project, series of lectures and hands-on working simulation attended by over 10 faculty. And these are world leaders such as Dr. Diringer, Dr. Mano, Dr. Torbay, to name a few. So they really got a unique opportunity, which you and I, when we were fellows and residents applying to fellowship, we were targeting to train with these guys, and we got them all together in this country and then trained them once and for all. So I'm extremely happy now. Looking back, it was just us trying to set up the program and educating that A, brain death exists, B, that's how you do it, C, we changed the law, to now we got world leaders sharing that message with the obviously granularity that they were able to deliver.
Yeah, it's so impressive, the initiatives that have been put in place to train physicians. I wonder, has the cultural shock from the family side changed at all in the past few years, or do you think that's going to take a lot longer?
It certainly changed. There's more acceptance, less hesitance, less doubting, and it will definitely take more time, but we've made, so there was also congruent nationwide message from the ministry, from the government, lots of education to the nation to understand that this exists right now. So there is less hesitance, there's less doubt. We feel more comfortable conducting them, less challenged, but there's still a lot of ways to go. And the other aspect, in terms of the support from the NeuroICU, and coming back to the point about spreading the message about the importance of neurocritical care. So a lot of these attendees also opened their eyes that, oh, wow, there's not only brain death, but remember, these are the all-stars of neurocritical care, right? There's a society, there's neurocritical care world leaders. They read about them, they know about them. oh, okay, they have a dedicated units where they come from, and we were successful showing them also our unit here. So all of this, and we had people not only from the UAE, we had people from Bahrain, from Egypt, Jordan, neighboring countries. So they all went back, and already actually we're getting some invites to go to other neighboring nations to talk about brain death, but also talk about neurocritical care and embed in their conference the neurocritical care concept. So it took the brain, started in brain death, but I know over the years it's going to expand to bigger than that, which is the neurocritical care concept in the region.
Wow. I mean, you've already accomplished so much, but is there any other project or goal in the near future you hope to achieve?
Look, so professionally or at the unit level at Neuro ICU, I think the biggest work is joining. So on a Cleveland Clinic Abu Dhabi, we're fortunate that all our programs flourished, be it Neuro ICU, Neuro IR, neurosurgery, neuroanesthesia, resources. Thankfully, we have it all. And we're able to deliver really the highest standards that is in the US and everywhere in the biggest centers to the patient. So there I'm fulfilled. And we're fulfilled as Cleveland Clinic, and we achieved that goal. Now, frankly, is beyond our double doors. And this is where I'm fortunate that the Neurocritical Care Society and the MENA chapter is able to accomplish through ECC and others, because we need to tell the rest of the Emirates here and the neighboring regions there is a huge value of neurocritical care dedicated units. You don't have to hire a neurointensivist dedicated from the US or Europe, because we've also trained a lot of our doctors from Egypt, from India here that work with me. We train them, and they're great physicians. And we don't have a fellowship, but I think I have 2 or 3 superstars that if I had a fellowship, I would have awarded them a fellowship already. So, and we want to see that, because we want the patients across the nation and neighboring countries get the true missing link between pulmonary critical care and neurology, neurosurgery. So I think I'll be fulfilled the next years to come to see these programs, at least in conferences, but also in concept and reality, evolve in the region. That's probably what I wish to see.
Wow, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope this message spread wide about the interesting part of this region, and we hope to see many come visit us. And any questions or queries, I'm sure there's a way for them to find out my contacts. Happy to address them.
Thanks, Jimmy.